So, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining this dialogue on weaving knowledges. And I just want to start by doing a bit of a smudge and thanking all of the ancestors, all the lands on which we are living and meeting, and of all of our lineages and ancestors that are supporting this work in spirit. All of our human and non human kin. Thank you. Thank you for this medicine. All right. And thank you, Sara, for bringing your wisdom to us today. Sara and I used to work together and really enjoyed having conversations about how we weave Indigenous science into some of these spaces where not only people not understand it, but are actually hostile to it. So I was going to ask you to start off, Sara, if you would just give us an idea. How did you get interested in this whole type of work?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's something that's been growing with me for a while. So I started working and writing about Indigenous policy in 2008. And I was working in kind of an interesting organization that probably wouldn't really align with any of the kind of values that I have now. But I felt always a sort of a bit of a disconnect about, what the organization wanted me to say and what I actually personally felt. And that just grew, I guess, inside of me. And over time, I realized I wanted to do things differently. And I ended up just having more and more contact, I think, with Aboriginal people and talking to them about different things and recognizing my own biases. I think it's just like a gradual process of awakeness, if you're awareness, if you like. And I think really has been from talking to Aboriginal people more. And I think, working where I was working and having, the opportunity to have more Aboriginal colleagues and stuff than I've ever had before, it was just really wonderful. If I could pinpoint an exact time, it was probably 2012 when I had an Indigenous or Aboriginal woman who was working as a research intern with me. And she was fabulous because she questioned a lot of what I was thinking, and she was really great. And that's when it really, really started hitting with me. But then I think it grew more and more from there. And I think as yourself as well. So when you started working, the questions and things that you were bringing to the table, that was just, I guess, awakening more things in my mind, making me more aware. And I'd started this PhD as well in 2000. I started thinking about it in 2018. And when I was thinking about it, I was questioning, is it right that I do this research because I'm a non-Aboriginal woman? I'm from Kiwi from New Zealand. What's she doing writing about, Indigenous social enterprises? And I talked to an Aboriginal woman who had actually suggested there's particular supervisors for my PhD. And I told her about how I was feeling. And she said, we need more allies. So then it got me thinking, well, what is a good ally as opposed to,
Hmm.
a bad ally? I guess you can't really be a bad ally, but as opposed to someone writing just about Aboriginal people as opposed to being, actually an ally.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. What is a good ally? And you and I have talked about this when you're in some of these spaces. If you're a non-LGBTQI person and you're in that space, or you're a non-Aboriginal person in the space you're in, there's always this feeling of insecurity because you don't have that same lived experience. But then you are bringing that allyship and that outsider perspective where you can see things that people can't see when they've been in it, right? So, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience and some of the challenges you have with that?
Sort of seeing things but not being in it. You're being outside. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So um, It's interesting because I feel like sometimes with my PhD in particular, you actually you have to operate within this Western framework, obviously, a very academic process. You know, they've got these particular things you have to do, research milestones, they call them. You've got to write a research proposal and you have to do things in a certain way. And it's very hard to do it in a different way. And I've got two supervisors. So I've got an Aboriginal supervisor and a non-Indigenous woman from Canada who comes from a health background. She's very, she's more scientific and analytical, I think. And my Indigenous supervisor and I are probably more or less, you know, just go with the flow type stuff, and also thematic and not looking at things so, you know, in such a like positivist kind of way. And how to actually you know, because one of the things I wanted to do with my PhD was to have the sort of theoretical underpinning being Indigenous standpoint theory, and by that I meant like recognizing privileging Indigenous voice and taking a step back as you know a non-Indigenous researcher, you know, saying this is not, I'm not the expert on this, all I'm doing here is providing if you like a vehicle for explaining or describing or you know some of the things that are happening, and I guess elevating the idea around the Indigenous ways of looking at things. But then I actually, as a non-Aboriginal person, don't know exactly what the, you know,
How to look at it that way.
yeah, I can't stand as a non-Indigenous person. I can't, in a way, I can't embody that. So how do I actually do this? You know, and I felt like, oh, this is just all like, what am I doing here? I'm crazy. I can't talk about something when I'm not that. I don't really know, you know, I'm not, you know, who am I to say this? So then I thought, well, it's really important that I have people that I talk to about this. So that's why I've established an advisory group for my PhD of Aboriginal people who've, you know, in the Indigenous social enterprise space, to guide me in my thinking. And because I don't want to offend anyone, but and it's really hard. So you don't know, like, am I going to be accused of, I guess there's this feeling that appropriation or something as well. And I feel like, you know, in the Indigenous space, there's so many non-Indigenous researchers that either like trying to do something that's that really paternalistic kind of approach, or a real kind of trying to become an Indigenous person themselves. Do you know what I mean? And we can't, you know, you have to acknowledge that you're not. I think that's really important, you know. Sorry, I kind of go off on long tangents.
No, that's all really valuable part of the journey of the so when you think about weaving knowledges and you're focusing in this particular piece of work on Indigenous social businesses, I know a lot of it for you has been, well, what is an Indigenous social business and how do I see it? But then when I talk to people, how do they see it? And how do I make sure that I keep in that dialogue with myself and evolving the way I see it from what I'm hearing from people, how they see it, right? So where
Yeah,
are
and
you
it's
right now? How do you
well, this is it's really interesting because I had this like I didn't really, you know, because you just don't know until you talk to people, right? So
yeah.
social enterprise, I thought, oh, this is a term that people are familiar with, you know. I thought, you know, because of my own background and stuff, and everyone's talking about social enterprises. Start talking to a group of Aboriginal business people. We don't like that word social enterprise. We hate that word. And my whole thesis is about social enterprises. I'm like, what the fuck? Okay, so that's a word that's very like not a word that resonated with my Aboriginal advisory group. They say as a social enterprise to them is quite a negative, kind of has a negative connotations as well in Australia in particular. So it was really interesting to understand all this, um, and then I think that it's been enlightening for me. And I think if I didn't have the advisory group, then what, you know, like I wouldn't have been aware of all this. So it just reinforced to me the importance of talking to people and getting different perspectives on things and recognizing that, you know, you have your own lens, right? And you can't, you actually, you know, your way of looking at things, how do you, the only way you're going to look at things in a different way is by asking other people and talking to other people and seeing what they think, you know, and questioning your own views as well.
And but being open to that.
Yeah.
So I know you've had a lot of experiences in your work, like you had experiences working with government where you're like, okay, I've heard and this is the view that makes sense to Aboriginal people. And now I'm the ally, and I'm in this role of advocating, and I'm a bridge, right? I'm trying to go between listening and whatever they're sharing with me and into this Western space and tell government people who are a bit farther away from being able to listen to them. So I'm trying to bridge that, right? So
Yeah.
when you go to you go to the government, you're like, all right, well, this is my effort in trying to bridge to, get this information across to you. And I know you have struggles with that. And I thought you might share that example of the fishing work that you did in recent years and trying to bridge that knowledge and understanding communication gap.
It's an ongoing thing, I think. Government says all the right things. Often they say they want to incorporate, co-design is the most overused word, and I absolutely hate it. And they wanted to co-design something with Aboriginal people, but they really don't know what co-design means, and they will never actually give up power in order to do that properly.
Mm.
So anyway, they want to consult and whatever. So we try and give them some advice around incorporating, I guess, Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous knowledge into the policy, because this policy was about cultural fishing, but the policy had nothing to do with culture. So their way of what they were developing was these local management plans for fishing, cultural fishing. They were trying to manage cultural fishing because they've got this idea that cultural fishing is leading to the depletion of fishing stock, which is really not true at all. It's other recreational fishes that are, and other, commercial fishing. It's not cultural fishing that's leading to the depletion of fishing stock.
Mm.
Anyway, so they want to police, essentially. They're trying to police cultural fishing. So the whole premise is flawed. It's never going to work, right? And so what they're trying to do is they're wanting to have bag limits for cultural fishing people to say this is how many. They were going to communities, and they were asking communities to tell them how many, what the bag limits would be for different species of fish. And no one was turning up to their consultations because they're horrible, consultations. And they weren't aligned with their cultural values and what they wanted to do. No one wanted to put into a box how many fish they would, how many, what the catch limit or what the collection limit, whatever it is for the bags would
It
be for
doesn't make
different
any sense.
species. It didn't make any sense. So they're just not engaging with that stupid kind of idea. And so we were trying to tell government, because they were kind of like frustrated that no one's turning up to their meetings. And we said, well, this is because it's not culturally respectful
Mm.
and it's not appropriate. And you need to be looking at the Indigenous knowledge around, cultural fishing. And they have seasonal calendars. And these seasonal calendars actually show you, the different times of the year when different species of fish are spawning and things like that. And when you don't, you're obviously not going to catch fish when there's laying eggs or whatever, and you're going to make sure they Aboriginal people know the times of the year according to the season, and their seasons are much more nuanced than our 4 seasons. And I think every different cultural groups have different seasons. So I think from my experience, Northern Territory has different ones because it's based on how the country is in that
Different
particular
land.
area.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they know, and they know when certain trees flower and certain things, and how they're all related. Like the fish will start jumping or something, the mullet will start jumping
Mm.
when something's, happens. I can't remember exactly, but some seasonal thing will happen, and they'll be able to tell. They have all these indicators, and they have all this vast knowledge. And then we as non-Aboriginal people, these Western people, just not listening. You're not paying any attention to this knowledge, not recognizing the wisdom. And I feel it's very frustrating, and I can't imagine how frustrating it is to be an Aboriginal person and just know that. I mean, it must be, I don't know. I can't even imagine how frustrating it is. But I try to explain to these fishers, there's policy people from Department of Primary Industries, and it wasn't really taken on board. They didn't really listen. They didn't really understand. So I think you could try and be a bridge, but if there's nothing on the other side, so I don't know if you can actually bridge some people. It's like this, do you know what I mean? Like,
It's oil and water. They're just not. Yeah.
collapses, the bridge collapses because they're not really open to doing things in a different way or really being respectful, and they have this. My experience is, even if they say, they want to support Aboriginal, self-determination or whatever they want to do, they can't actually do it because they are so stuck in their own bias. They
Mm.
can't see the value of Aboriginal ways of doing things and thinking, Indigenous paradigms or whatever you want to call it.
So
They
so
just, yeah.
what makes you understand like how people break that down? Like have you I mean you have obviously broken it down in yourself. You're like, "Oh, I want to look at my biases and have conversations with people," right? And I know you work with other people who think that way as well. Um so what's your understanding of how we start weaving those knowledges and breaking down some of those biases and barriers? Like what seems to motivate people or cut through or
Um, I can talk a little bit about how I did it with myself. So I thought if I'm talking about Indigenous standpoint theory, then I need to talk about what my own standing is. And that was quite an enlightening process because I didn't really know what my own standing was.
Mm,
What do I think and what, then I realized I don't really like putting a label on things. So that was a thing I think as well. I realized I found it hard to describe what my standing is or what my views are. So I guess when we're talking about standing, we're talking about, it's, what your values as well as your belief systems and stuff.
yeah.
And I just, to express what those are was actually really hard, and to see where I guess the things that had influenced me, like trying to look at, okay, what's the kind of stuff underpinning where I've come from, like my
Unpacking
views,
your own
unpacking
standpoint
my
just
own
so you
stuff.
can see someone else's standpoint. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think then I realized there's so many contradictory kind of things happening in my life, which was interesting as well.
Mm.
So working, effectively in a right wing think tank, and now I'm working in in an Aboriginal community controlled organisation. But I think I think the first thing is to recognise that there's different, for people, if they're open to it, though, this is the thing, they have to be open to it, I think, a bit of self-assessment or a bit of reflection, and seeing, what are the sort of biases or the values that I have, and if they can do that, then that's the start. Then it's also about, I think, just trying to be open-minded and to say, oh, well, just because I think something doesn't mean it's right.
Mm.
And I find that with government, though, they very much think that their way of doing things is the right way of doing things. So it's very hard to have a kind of conversation with that to counteract that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
And even when they say they want to do co-design, they can't. The process is always geared around their time frame, so it's really never a proper process. That's,
Mm.
they can't relinquish enough of the control of the time frames or whatever to actually, for it to be a proper, you know,
Sharing of power.
co-design. Yeah,
Yeah.
sharing of power.
Yeah.
And I really don't know how to make them do it, to be honest. I guess that's the thing. I really don't know what the solution is.
Yeah.
For government to be more open-minded and to be more, appreciative of other ways of doing things and to step back.
Yeah.
I think you need to step back more. We need to step back more and be there in the background more, perhaps helping facilitate things, not taking the lead when I think it comes to I think that's something I'm learning because I talk too much. You're right. You probably picked that up already. But is to let to try and listen more.
Mm. I feel like you're
Yeah.
a very good listener. I mean, that's how you've been able to unpack all of this for yourself, right? Like,
Yeah.
hmm. When you think about your own identity as you've been questioning this and being in these spaces, when we were talking the other day, how everybody's indigenous to somewhere. You may have to go farther back in your lineage, right? Have you been unpacking that for yourself a bit more recently? Like, what does that mean to you? Where do you feel this connection to a place, or is that the same place where your ancestors are from? And
Yes, so something I've always been kind of aware of as well. I think it might be partly to do with my schooling, is this commonality between, you know, humans. We're all humans, right? And if you look at different mythologies and stuff, which I've always found fascinating, there's so many similarities. So I grew up in New Zealand, and we have Maori myths and stuff, and they have this character called Maui, who's like a trickster. And then I was also learning about the North mythology, and they have the same kind of character called Loki. So there's all these similar kind of things. Anyway, this is probably slightly off your question, but anyway, that's always been something that I've been fascinated with. So this was at 9 or 10 years old. I, was learning this at school, and I thought, this is interesting. The world is like, so there's similarities and different, like
Yeah.
humans are similar and different, right? And I've always kind of had that, I guess, coming through from then on. And then when I was trying to work out what my standing is, I did a little bit of like, what is my history? So I'm a fifth generation New Zealander. So my family came to New Zealand on my mum's side in the 1800s, and they settled in the sort of Gisborne area of New Zealand, which is the east coast. It's a large Maori community there. And actually, I have Maori relations, but not, they're by marriage. So not by blood, but by marriage. So I've got cousins who are Maori, and I've got uncles that are, but not directly related to me. And far back in the past, we're related to the particular, there was a woman who was known as the Maori Queen. So Cooper, Dame Whenua Cooper, I think her name was. So the Cooper family. So when I go back with my mum to visit her her nana, she lived in the East Coast. They had this great old family kind of estate, this sort of lovely old house. But we'd also go for a drive to the marae as well. And so I have memories of running around in marae as a child. I'd have no, like it's a kind of like just me playing. I was just playing with a great group of kids. So that's my background, and it just kind of absorbed this. And at school in New Zealand as well, learning Maori is compulsory. So, well, it wasn't my school anyway. We had Maori, and when I say that, we learned songs, and we didn't learn to speak very well, but I understood words, and I still use some words sometimes on my kids. So they kind of like filtered through into me, as part of who I am. And I feel like,
Yeah.
like itu, it's just such a good word, which means stand up. But yeah, so it just filtered through to who I am as a person, I think. In New Zealand is a more, and I think, I'm not saying it's the case that every New Zealander is like this. There's a lot of racism in New Zealand as well, but I feel like that Maori culture is more a part of your identity as a New Zealander than it's kind of, you take it on board as your own identity. Like, this is part of being a New Zealander. That's why I call myself a Pākehā woman, because I feel like I have that the Maori culture is a part of my identity, because it's my shared history as well. Like, even though I would never say that I'm Maori, but it's like I grew up with that around. It's feeling like
On
that
that
part of, that's
country.
who I am.
Yeah, and you have a connection
Yeah,
to
as a
that
New
country.
Zealander.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's what I was like, thinking about that, and thinking about my first experience, I guess, of Maori spirituality, or Indigenous spirituality, was a story that my mum told me. So I've got a strange family background too. My parents were hippies. We lived on a commune. My mum got kicked out of the commune. She, she didn't know where to go. And one of the reasons why she got kicked out of the commune, so I'll give a bit more of a backstory, was my grandfather, who's a doctor, he also liked collecting things, and he got this bit of greenstone from the South Island, and he found it, and he kept it, and because he's a collector, and God knows, collected everything. But there was a story that it's tapu. It doesn't. He shouldn't have kept it. He should have given it back to the Maori people of that tribe, the Ngātahu, and he kept it. And then my uncle was in a car accident and died. So this group of people in this commune that my mum was part of, they knew the story, and they thought my mum had a curse on her, like, because of this, that her family had this tapu, object, and they kicked her out of the commune, and she didn't know where to go. And someone, I don't know, she must have talked to someone. They suggested that she go and see Auntie Noi, and Auntie Noi is this amazing. There's a book about her. She's amazing. She's this Maori woman that was part of the whole Maori cultural renaissance kind of movement in New Zealand, and she was really open, and she would invite Pākehā people into her home and everything, and she was a songwriter. She sung songs. She was amazing with art as well. She's an artist, and anyway, she was sharing her art and her singing and everything, her culture, as well as advocating for, I think, land rights and Maori rights in general. But she was playing that role of bridge, if you like. She was between the Maori and the Pākehā. She was a really amazing woman, and so my mum was told to go and see her, and she turned up on her doorstep, and Auntie Noi said to her, "Hello, dear. I had a dream about you." Like, actually recognised her and knew her, and said, "I've been expecting you."
Mm.
And she looked after my mum for 2 weeks. I let my mum stay in her house for 2 weeks, and basically, because my mum was, I think, after being kicked out of the commune and being forced to leave my sister and I behind, was quite, I think, depressed, semi-suicidal, not knowing what to do with herself, And she healed my mum, basically. She healed my mum, gave my mum enough strength that she could go back and collect my sister and I. So my mum told me that story, and I was just like, wow. And I remember, actually, I didn't know who she was, but I remember meeting this lovely woman. It would have been a mum, and I spoke to my mum about it. She said, "Yeah, that was Auntie Noi." And just that presence, that feeling that when you're around someone who's really, I don't know, like, you just feel that wisdom, right, coming off them. That's the kind of person that she was, and just loving the love as well, that generosity. And so I always had in my head, even though I went down a very kind of, writing policy, academic kind of thing, but I always had, I think, in the background somewhere as well, this appreciation for the spiritual, Indigenous spirituality. I just hadn't really thought about it, really. I've been,
Consciously, yeah.
thinking about other things until recently. And also until I went to Arnhem Land as well. So as part of my work as a consultant and also as a researcher, I've been very privileged to go to different Indigenous communities and actually meeting people like Auntie Noi, basically, who just have that presence, that amazing, and you just think, wow, we're so fucked. Sorry, non-Indigenous people.
You just perceive her as like very centered and
So calm, peace. Like, it just, I don't know how to describe it. It's like, and the way they say things too, like, not they. It sounds bad when I say it like that, but like, when I was in Arnhem Land, we were talking to this woman, and just the way they have particular nicknames for people, and it sums up, it's like this, like the essence of people. So there's this guy who just he kind of jumps around all over the place, and his nickname meant like kangaroo or something, because he's always, and rustling leaves, because this other guy was talk really quietly and he sounded like rustling leaves. It's just this, I don't know, I just loved all that kind of the analogy that was part of everything. It's like everything's connected to something.
yeah.
And nature as well. It's like this amazing, I don't know, it's a way of
So
connecting
grounded.
everything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 That's
So
a
that's
beautiful
kind of a weird kind of background story.
that's a beautiful story of also the fact that your after 5 generations, your mom was so connected that she went to this woman and the woman had had a dream about her, that it was already this shared like psychic space that they found each other in that way is really lovely. Hmm.
Yeah, and so we kept visiting Auntie Noi, I think, when we go back and see my mum's family as well. And
Hmm.
yeah, and my mum actually was wanting to walk the greenstone. There's this greenstone path that you go from the west coast to the south of the South Island to the east coast over the mountain ranges. And she's very, yeah, she's very. I guess that she's had an influence on me. I have to confess. Yeah, and my thinking. And as a child as well, I remember thinking like this idea that God is everywhere, like in nature and stuff. I just had that feeling, even though I wrote this. I wrote Strange Child at 12 writing about this, but
Hmm.
I just had that feeling, right? So I don't know exactly where it came from, but it's just when I started reading more and stuff that I've been reading for my thesis around that holistic and interconnection, and it just makes sense to me. Like, this is a statement of truth, if you like, right? And why aren't more non-Indigenous people recognizing this wisdom, and how can we you know actually elevate that Indigenous voice so that more people can listen. And there's this word that a colleague of mine used to use, which is what we do all the time, I think, with Aboriginal people's writing or views and stuff. We feel uncomfortable about some of the stuff or whatever, and we want to whitewash it. We want to put our own lens on it. And so even when I feel like even when Aboriginal people, and they're very like so generous in sharing their knowledge and stuff,
Yeah.
it gets kind of this whitewashing as well. So we dilute it as well, So
In a way, do you feel like
yeah,
so that's a very interesting thing, right? It's diluted, and then I would say, does that mean that it makes it so somebody is able to digest a piece of it that then might send them on a journey to digest more? Or do you see it more in the negative of it's so diluted that it's lost its power and wisdom, and I'm not really sure what we're conveying anymore? Like, how do you perceive that?
I see it can go like two ways, definitely. So there's a definitely, and you see that a lot, and that's what I think probably didn't articulate it so well at the beginning. But when I'm talking about cultural appropriation
Mm,
and this kind of exotification, if you like, of Indigenous people, that's a negative kind of aspect that can happen. I think when people think that they can somehow become Indigenous, especially if they go and get like someone gives them a skin,
skin name, yeah.
language name or whatever, like people get crazy about shit, and especially in the academic space. So you've got some academics that are writing like they're so, like they're special, unique little things that have got this connection. And then you've also got, I think, the problem of, that kind of commodification as well, which can lend itself to when you're taking something and you're not looking at the whole. So I feel like people have taken this idea of yarning circles, right? This is just an example of research methodology. They say it's an Indigenous research methodology, yarning circles. So you'll have all these articles, peer-reviewed journal articles talking about yarning circles, but that's not the, that's just a, you're taking a part. It's not the, you can't. So I think I have to say you've helped me with my thinking around this. It's if you don't have the whole, then it's just
It's a very bastardized version, and
it's a bastardized version. Yeah.
I've read so many articles where they use, for example, yarning circle and focus groups interchangeably, which already tells me everything that they don't understand. What the yarning circle is. The yarning circle is not just people sitting in a circle and talking about what you've asked them to talk to you about, right? It's a whole different process. And again, not my culture. So I can speak as an outsider observing and having experienced something that an Aboriginal person called a yarning circle. And then I can speak to peace circles that I've facilitated and I've been taught to facilitate with some Native Americans and others from my culture, but they're all a bit different.
And that's where I think we need to recognize that, and I think you're the one that's suggested it to me as well. This diagram that you had, I think from memory, it's like you got to be, Aboriginal people have got to be involved in the process from the very beginning. Like it's the values, it's the lens, it's the whole paradigm. And then it's the, the theory, and then it's the methodology. So I think people are just picking and choosing, and they're going straight for the methodology, which would be yarning circles,
Mm,
without looking at the whole. And you're not going to get it right if you're just going with that piecemeal approach.
yeah.
And I think to get the whole, you can't actually, as a non-Aboriginal person, you can't do it in isolation. You cannot do any of this research, I think,
It all requires partnerships
a
and
partner with and also I think not just partnership, but actually, and this is a difficulty in trying to do a PhD and then take a back seat. Like you can't, it's a bit impossible. But the idea is that you can't be the leader either. You have to be
there has to be a humility there, right? That is one of
yeah,
the,
that's right. That's the
right?
word. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
can't say I'm doing this and
But
come
that
along
is,
with me.
well, but that's in conflict, which is part of what you're talking about, your experience with the PhD, right? Because when you're doing a PhD, there's constantly this push of like, you are now becoming the expert in this. And you're basically saying, I'm trying to become an expert in, like, humbly stepping back and like creating space for these voices. That's not really playing the Western game, right?
No, that's right. So what it's because the Western game is what do you think and what's your opinion, what's your argument, and what's
Yeah,
the evidence to back up your argument,
yeah.
and they, like, just like I think the whole process of doing a PhD is, as you say, it's very academic Western sort of system. And the scoping review thing that I did for my literature review is kind of in conflicts with the idea that I have of doing Indigenous standpoint theory, which privileges Indigenous voice and recognizes, I think the thing about Indigenous standpoint theory, it's not just privileging Indigenous voice, it just recognizes that ongoing power imbalance, that colonization has not actually ended. We're still colonizing and colonized, and that there's the power imbalance. Essentially, it's recognizing that power imbalance that the Indigenous people have in the current, society. So how do you incorporate that viewpoint with a scientific kind of approach? They don't actually, you can't. I think that's what I've realized now. I've recognized you can't actually incorporate them into each other.
Mm.
They are two distinct things. And I think this idea of weaving is with I think is it Robin Zimmerman? Is that her Zimmerman? Is it?
Yeah, she
I
talks
forgot.
about it, and then there's the she talks about it as weaving, and then there's others who talk about it as kind of the more of a Venn diagram of certain areas of knowledge overlap. But yeah, she talks about like the braiding sweep.
Right. I liked her braiding analogy, the
Mm,
weaving braiding analogy, because I think when you start getting to the overlap is when you get the McDonaldization of culture
mm, mm.
sometimes.
It's too
That's where
simple.
it gets
Yeah,
it gets to it gets to that point where you're like, I don't know, it gets problematic because it could be appropriation or it could be like a, yeah, thanks, Max. Max has put the link in.
thank
Thank you. Braiding sweetgrass. Yes. So I really like that weaving thing. And I
you. Was
think
that how
that's
you experience it, Sarah? So when for yourself, when you're unpacking a lot of your things and you're getting reflections from other people, are you experiencing like, all right, I've unpacked this and I'm like making space for this? Is it feeling a bit like I'm weaving these together inside yourself, or are you just in this mad conflict, like what's happening?
I'd like to say I'm one of these orderly people that have weaved. But reality is not that. I think I'm still a bit kind of a bit kind of mad still in that. But I really think what I'd like to try and show is this is like there's a the okay. So if you look at the weaving analogy, what I like about it is that it's saying that the Indigenous way of looking at the world is distinct, and it can't actually, you can't separate, you can't merge it. It's always going to be distinct, like a braid, like a separate braid, if you like. So it's
It
because
doesn't
if
actually fit in the Western worldview. So this is this idea
yeah,
of living in two worlds and weaving these knowledges, that we actually have to continually make space for both, because the Western space is so big and we need that for survival at this point, but then the Indigenous space is still there and they're not quite seeing each other, right? So when you're
yeah,
coming from
but
where you are, where you've been in the Western space, then you have to keep unpacking to make space for the Indigenous, whereas other people maybe in Arnhem Land have had to deal with certain losses and make more space for the Western, right? Coming from a different.
yeah, and it's recognizing that they're two distinct, different braids, if you like. But what you're trying to do when you're braiding them together is is instead of it being them so separate that they're not touching, is that they're coming together to form a more cohesive whole. And that's and it's not to say there's a deficit in, and I think this is the thing that gets problematic, that I feel like there's a deficit in the Western way of looking at it, but not to say that the Indigenous needs to incorporate Western to become whatever, but it's more about, together though, the Western having the Indigenous knowledge as part, like incorporating it into something
Yeah.
will be much, um, more,
Helps work better, right? Like you were giving the
yeah,
example
more, yeah, exactly.
of the bag limit. So
And it's not to say yeah, and it's not to say the Indigenous has to be part of that braid if they don't want to, I don't
yeah,
think, but it's recognizing that I think this is the society stuff, right? It's we live in this what the world that we live in. So I think the Yolngu people, though, they talk about how they're always having to. They talk about this. They talk about the Balanda and they want two way. They always talk about the two. And they talk, but they keep the two separate though. They're not saying one has to become. We don't want assimilation. I guess what I'm trying to say. It's really not very clear. It's not about bringing one and becoming that or the other becoming. That's
no,
what
they're
happened with
still distinct,
assimilation, right?
right? So that's
Yeah.
the weaving and the braiding analogy.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
not
that's why I like the weaving and braiding because it's not about assimilating,
yes.
but it's about recognizing that when you look, there's a space for both together, and it makes the overall like more informed.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially from the Western point of view, much more informed having the Indigenous knowledge,
Yeah.
and I think that's what I like about it. But how do you actually do that? Is the I think the challenge,
Mm.
and how do you do that in a respectful way? Is an ongoing challenge. And I think I'm just realizing it now as I was talking to my supervisor earlier today. It's a process, right? It's never ending. So if you think it's a process that's going to actually end, then I think you need to reconsider because it's not. It's an ongoing process. It's a
It's a journey. Yeah.
and when I talk about it being a process, it's a constant reflection. It's an iterative. It's a cycle.
Yes.
Your medicine wheel thing.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
It's just you're
Uh,
always spiraling towards center, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I think I'll never know. I never, it's knowledge, acknowledging that I am different. I think this is the thing, because you do have some people who think they can become Indigenous almost if they just practice Indigenous ways of being,
Mm.
but they can't. I am who I am.
Mm.
Everyone's who they are. We are who we are.
Well, you're
So
not.
recognizing that, yeah.
It's different, right? Like you can have a connection with some of these places in New Zealand, and that's a real connection. That's meaningful, and that isn't the same as somebody whose ancestors have been there for many more generations and has that language connection with the place and has ceremony before colonization and all these different stories. So your connection is real, but it just isn't the
Mm.
same. It won't ever be the same.
It's not the same, exactly.
Yeah.
But then I think how to actually then talk about Indigenous ways of viewing things and talking about Indigenous ways of, doing business or social enterprise as a non-Indigenous person. How do I do that respectfully?
Mm.
Then is I'm taking what I've, read and stuff and taking it back to my advisory group and asking them if they think the way that I've ordered, like I've got these different themes and values that I've identified in the literature, and I'm asking them if they agree with those and if it resonates with them and if it makes sense. Um, and I guess I will be led by, I think, the advice and the direction that they give me. And I think in the academic space, how to actually do it in a humble way, is a challenge, I think, because it's just is kind of in conflict with that whole individual kind of,
Yeah.
ego
Sure.
ego of academics. um, but that's why I think it's an ongoing. I've just come to a realization it's going to be an ongoing process, and I'm never actually going to get it resolved, and I'll just have to keep trying. And I think as long as I keep trying and authentically trying, like not just pretending I'm trying, and being real, that maybe it will be okay. I don't know. Like I think I also have to be prepared to, and I think this is something I'm learning to just like that people. Not everyone's going to like what I write or like what I say, and not everyone's going to agree with what I say, and not all people are going to, see that I'm coming from a place that's, they're going to think, and that's their right too. They can think, that I'm not entitled to be writing about this. There will be people. I know there'll be people that think it's not appropriate for me to be writing about this, and I just have to accept that that's fine, because that's their, that's, they're entitled to their views, and part of me thinks they're right as well. So I just, I think that's just coming to that acceptance that, um, it's you're not going to please everyone. Everyone's going to like what you write, and this is hard for me because I like to please people. But yeah, so it's helping me a bit better, I think. But recognizing too that it's just like an ongoing process, that it's not going to be an end point where I'm going to have to stop thinking and reflecting. I think you just have to keep doing it forever, and that's part of the process of that's what Indigenous. When you look at the Younger Porter's article, he talks about that as well. It's like reflection. It's really important.
Tyson Younger Porter, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I love
yeah,
what you're saying about it being iterative in the process because, um, I mean, in Indigenous science is the broad, perspective on what are a lot of different specific cultural sciences that are very specific to place. And at the same time, as you were saying in the beginning, there are certain archetypes and patterns and things that we can look at across cultures and find similarities. And that's what we've been calling Indigenous science, which in large part is just trying to hold up a mirror to Western science just to help them see each other. just, just to say, this is our system. It's just as valid as your system. This is our science. It's just as valid as your science. Different frameworks. Like I love the example of acupuncture, right? Because that's from traditional Chinese science, and Western science has studied it and come to the conclusion that it definitely works, and we have no idea how, right? And traditional Chinese science is like your studies about our science make absolutely no sense because you completely miss the entire like foundation of how you would even study why what we're doing works. We can tell you, but you have to actually learn our system, right? Yeah.
that's an interesting, yeah, because I think the whole thing with Western science is just like has to prove, we don't understand how something works when that can't be scientific. And so there's so little knowledge, especially I think Indigenous knowledge around water.
Mm.
And there's a hydrologist, I think Brad Moggeridge. He's this interesting presentation that he's done, which I could share. But he talked about that and how much we could learn, how much Australia and policy people could learn if they actually open their minds to see that there's this whole wisdom there, because they already know where the water flows were. They knew where they did all this underground sort of mapping or whatever, and the Aboriginal people knew before they did it. Do you know what I mean? And they had the different water holes, and they had names that meant black and red and stuff. And they actually found that, because I think it might have been the minerals in the ground or something, that there was, like it was, they knew it already. They'd
The
already
knowledge
had
was
that
already
knowledge.
there,
Yeah.
and there
And
was not communication about it. Yeah.
it's just the way they don't respect. It's this lack of respect, I think, when it comes down to it. I'm trying to think what it is the biggest barrier for government and policy and stuff.
Or
It's
not
the lack of
trusting, I
respect.
guess, for me. It's like I don't understand your knowledge and I don't trust it because I don't understand it. Mm.
Yes. And because I can't verify it, so it can't be scientific because I haven't been able to verify it. So then when they could verify this, right? So this is an example
Mm.
of when oh, okay, well, maybe there is something to this
Right.
because it matched what we found scientifically. So
Right.
therefore, maybe we will listen now to these Indigenous knowledge holders around water. But this is the crazy stuff, right? We only listen to you once we've had it verified by our Western scientific methods.
It's
Um,
that supremacy wound, right? Like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Mm.
But I think if we don't, and I mean, people use a little like right words like this part of this closing the gap stuff around partnership and shared decision making, but they can't actually do it because they can't relinquish. They can't make shared decisions because they don't want to relinquish any power. So I think I think there's a I think that's why I think there's a role for non-Indigenous people in this space, because when
Mm.
to help elevate the voice, to advocate on behalf as well, because the population in Australia is only around 3.5% of the overall population. And if there wasn't non-Indigenous people in this space advocating and arguing for the recognition and respect of Indigenous people, then there wouldn't be any attention, that, you know, wouldn't be enough people, you know. So we do, I think we do have a role.
Yeah.
I really think we do, but we have to be respectful about our place in that role. So I think it's not for us to necessarily be the ones. I feel like we have more of a role perhaps in the background, you know,
Facilitating,
supporting it,
supporting
supporting
it.
the Indigenous people,
Yeah.
facilitating. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's
But
really
I'm sure yeah. But and then how to, I don't know, how to write that though, you know, is another thing. How do I write in a opinionated way? Sorry, you know, of my own opinions. How do I do that? I don't know. That's the thing I'm still learning, I think. Yeah.
well, you do have you can't genocide yourself. You have to include yourself in it, but just from what you're saying, right? You include yourself very clear of your standpoint. Hmm.
Yes, and so that's it. Yeah, that's what I think that's the right method. Yeah, I think just acknowledge who I am and my own biases up front,
Hmm.
and that I see things in a particular way, and I'm trying to do this, but you know, there will always be that bias that I can't, and I'm not, you know, and I can't understand. I can sympathize and I can empathize, or rather, whatever.
Yeah.
I will never know,
Yeah.
you know?
That's well,
Yeah.
yeah, and I love that humility about you too, and I love too that you look at this Maori woman you shared the story about, and you're like, oh, it just shows me how messed up I am, and I do really respect and understand what you're saying. That you get this reflection of somebody who's so centered, and you're like, what happened to me and my ancestors that we've all this stuff going on, and life is so complicated, and we left our lands and settled here, and all of this craziness, but at the same time, I look at you and I think, well, there's value in the fact that you can look at that person and get such a solid reflection of yourself and all of the conflict you're able to carry, there's value in being able to hold that and then be able to weave and look at this in this way and look at that in that way because you're supporting people in this space as you're bridging, right? And then as Aboriginal people need less and less support, hopefully in future generations, then be able to turn attention back to, some of your Anglo relations and help the ones who are stuck unpacking do a bit more unpacking. So because you're carrying all of that, right?
Yeah, and I think too, you know, often like there's always been like the focus on Aboriginal people in Australia to learn Western ways of being. I think we should start focusing on non-Aboriginal people learning Aboriginal ways.
Yeah.
It's not, we've just been very one-sided, and we've always been asking them to look at it from our perspective and understand our jargon, and you know, we need to think, we need to turn it around. We need to actually um, turn it upside down, I think.
That's what Marion Rose said.
Yeah.
She's the Australian Elder of the Year this year, and
Oh yes, that's right. That's probably where I heard it. I've appropriated it now.
because she's
Yeah.
she's always putting forward about Dadiri and that deep listening tool from her culture. Yes, she said that, we Indigenous people have worked really hard to see you and walk towards you, and it's time for you to walk towards us now, which is
Yeah, I 100% agree with her. I think I read that and it's kind of into my head, but I don't know where I got it from. Yes, 100%. I think we should listen to Miriam Rose.
respect our elders. Yes.
Respect our, absolutely, absolutely. Like such, it just makes me, I like the wisdom that is there, do you know what as well? Every time it's the humbleness as well, the um
Mm.
just the beautiful, you know, so much shit's happened, and they can be so just so loving towards a fucking stupid white girl. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, you
So
feel
yeah,
gener-
I don't know where you get all this compassion, all this. Well, I can't think of the word. It's not compassion. It's not. It's more like generosity.
yeah,
That's the word. It's a generosity.
yeah.
Amazing generosity. Amazing.
Mm,
Yeah,
mm,
and sharing and just, you know, talking, and that's what I've been astounded by, is that is amazing generosity of time and knowledge.
mm.
Yeah.
Well, that's a
More people could experience if they were just open to it. Do you know what I mean?
that's
If,
a beautiful
yeah.
note to end on the generosity of the
Yeah.
Indigenous peoples of these lands. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I thought I'd just, if anyone had a ending question or comment, we'll just take a moment to give an opportunity. And thank you to Max for adding into the chat. Miriam Rose, Ungan Mayer, and Tyson and Robin Wall Kimmerer's link. Appreciate it.
There's another one too. I'll just add his recent article, so I'll try and find it. Max, you're awesome. Can I say Max has helped me a lot on my path to known better things. Now the problem is, how do I?
Oh, perfect. Thank
Yeah.
you. Lucas has a question and he's.
Oh, a comment, really.
Yeah, just go ahead.
Should I move to the front?
Yeah, come here.
Don't hide behind the medicine wheel.
Hello.
Hi.
No, I'm actually going to read it because I wrote it down and texted it to Valerie because I wasn't sure how to do it awkwardly. But for me, I think I'm not really comfortable sort of with either or thinking on this idea of weaving versus blending versus overlap.
Right, you think it's both?
It's all of it because it's about relational dynamics. So for me, they can all be true at the same time. And
that's a good point. Yeah.
How we describe it depends on the relational dynamics and the various means of showing respect and feeling whole. So in my personal life, this idea of blending is inevitable because what I feel like I'm doing is trying to feel more whole and deal with like deficiencies and wounds and imbalances and blind spots in my culture and in my knowledge. So blending is about wholeness for me on a personal level. But then if I'm in a relationship with an Aboriginal person who's teaching me something, I might be thinking of that as weaving because that's a way of honoring and showing respect to the uniqueness of what I'm being shown. But then there could be another dynamic where it's more like that Makarrata dynamic. And in that case, it might be more like overlap because it's really about being really boundaried and saying we're coming at this from really different experiences and perspectives. So we might talk about it even more distantly, like overlap. So, for me, it's about allowing for this process of indigenizing for people who need to live together in a healthy way on the same land, on the same country, whilst also acknowledging the unique standing of the First Peoples. I feel like it has to be all of the above because otherwise we'll maintain these separate identities, and that's politics to me.
Yeah, I think that's what the braid is, though. It's bringing it together, but recognizing that it's still distinct. I think it's still the togetherness is still, and maybe it's like, I think the idea is the same, is that you can't be two separate braids. I'm not very, yeah, they have to be, yeah. So it is a mingling, but in the mingling, it's retaining the separate as well, which what I like. So it's like you've got the salt water and they talk about the salt water and the fresh water mingling, but you still have salt water and you still have fresh water.
Right. But as an individual, I want to feel like a whole person.
Right. So you want both. You want both.
It's not that I want both. I need both.
You need both. Yeah.
To be a whole person.
Yeah. And that's the braid, right? Or whatever it is, the Venga, I don't know what you call it, but it is together. It is together, but it's also bounded, I think. Because I know that's what I liked about the braid, because it's together but bounded. But I think there can be a mingling as well. I think you're right. Maybe it's like, so hard and fast. Yeah.
My relationship to myself, it might be more like a blend.
Yes.
But talking about that exact same knowledge in another context, in another relational dynamic, I might want to honor and show respect to separateness and pointing at the different strands of the braid and saying, here's where I learned this and here's where I learned that. And I want to show honor and respect this elder who taught me that here. But then when I go home and I'm lying in bed at night with my head on the pillow, I'm trying to blend that much more cohesively so I feel like a whole person. So it's like it's both.
Yes, it is. I think you're right. I think together you're kind of, that's why maybe I couldn't answer the mist in my head thing, is because it's trying to.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult. It's difficult.
It's difficult. I think that's the thing, and it's not going to stop, is it? I feel like that's the thing. It's like,
it's all healing the colonization and remembering that, you know, we're all interconnected, and as you're saying, we have connections to these lands now, and maybe people in your family had responsibility because somebody took something they shouldn't have taken, and that energy had to play out, and that was something that your mom ended up being responsible for healing, right?
yeah, that's with her greenstone walk, I think, and she gave I think she did give the green. I don't know, because
yeah.
I have to check with her about that. But the greenstone ended up being passed down. I think she got a lot of my grandfather's things when he passed away, so I'm pretty sure she gave the greenstone back.
Yeah. Hmm.
She left it on the land where it came from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely that rebalancing of these relationships, but then as you're saying, there's the new relationship, and your identity as being, you know, Kiwi and Pākehā and all these, this is a new identity in your culture, right?
Yeah, and then you throw in what I think the fake Jewish. No, but you know, I just pretend Jew thing that I have. No, it's kind of interesting because I feel like that's the thing. Like when you try and like, so the hardest thing I've ever done was trying to work out my own standing. I think if everyone tried to do that, then they might appreciate other people's more.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's critical to being able to unpack what we were just talking about. Like, where are you blending? Where are you braiding? Where is there overlap? And these various ways of talking about it, you have to understand your own standing to be able to navigate that. And if you don't, then you're just going to be like a bull in a china shop, basically.
Yeah, that's what I found the hardest, is just trying to think myself, what are my values? What are my beliefs? You know, what's and I'm still like because I don't like putting labels on things. I find it hard to say I'm this or I'm that, but it's still like, what's influenced me, where, you know, like, and I think just even writing it all out, even if you can't clearly articulate it, it is good. And Maggie Walter, I have it in my room somewhere, but I don't know where the book is at the moment. Has in her book, it's really interesting diagram that actually helps, because she basically says that when we're talking about standing, we always end up just talking about Indigenous standpoint theory, not recognizing that non-Indigenous people have this as well, and that we need to be unpacking it as well. And she had this really good diagram that actually helped me, because it talks about, you know, your values, your beliefs, your ways of looking at things, you know, everything, and as every researcher, every person has this.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really rich, and I'm glad we went over so you guys could have that little unpacking. But I'm gonna end us now, and thank you so much, Sara, for all of your knowledge sharing, and thank you everybody who joined the dialogue. And this will go up on Facebook and YouTube later today if there are other people you know who might want to join the conversation or listen later. So thank you.
Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity, Valerie, and thanks to everyone that came on to listen. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.